Our gospel readings for the last few weeks have been fairly dire and fairly intense. And they all have come from this 10th chapter of the Gospel of John. And today we read the very last 3 verses of that 10th chapter of the Gospel of John. And I have to tell you that in the context of this chapter and of the readings that we've been reading from it for the last few weeks, these 3 beautiful verses seem to me to be a cup of cold water. I saw them coming as I've been preparing and preaching for the last few weeks. I said, oh, they're coming, those beautiful verses about welcome and hospitality. And to set the context a little bit, the context is Jesus is sending out his disciples, like he says, like lambs amidst wolves, like sheep amidst wolves. And he's talking to them about the kind of judgment and persecution that they'll face, which was very real in the time that the Gospel of Matthew was written. They were experiencing those things in the early church, the division even among family members. And he tells them, that they're to preach the good news, to heal the sick, to raise the dead, right? But he doesn't tell them how to do that. What he gives them a lot of very specific instructions about are how to find the right house to stay in, how to know if it's the right place to stay, what to do if it's not the right place to stay. And then at the end of this chapter, Jesus returns again to this theme of hospitality, this time from the perspective of the one who welcomes. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me. Whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. And then he goes on to say that the people who do the welcoming, the people who do the receiving, will receive the same reward as the people who go out and do the work, who are being welcomed. That this reward, that this recognition, that these wide open doors are not just for the people who go out and do the hard work of preaching and healing and raising the dead, but for the very people who just say, come on in, or hey, you look thirsty. And to me, those wide open doors, those wide open arms show not only the hospitality of the people who are doing the welcoming, the people who are supposed to be going out with this message, but the very hospitality of God. Now, if our gospel lesson is one that it's easy to find the grace in, our Old Testament lesson is a bit more challenging, isn't it? We're on track 1 during this season after Pentecost, which means that we're kind of hitting sort of some of the greatest hits of the Old Testament. And we've come to the story sometimes called the sacrifice of Isaac, which is clearly incorrect, sometimes called the near sacrifice of Isaac, which is just cumbersome, and more appropriately, I think, called the binding of Isaac, because that's the moment that it arrives at. And if you're sitting out there thinking, I could never do that. I could never, get to the point of if I thought God told me to kill my child to do that. Well, good. This story, I think, is about Abraham's faithfulness, but I think we see the faithfulness of Abraham when he expresses to the people who are with them, the boy and I will go and worship over there, and we will return to you. He expresses his faith when he says to God, as he says to his son, here I am. He expresses his faith most clearly when he answers Isaac's question about where the lamb for the burnt offering is. He says, my child, God will provide. And that's the moral of the story. That's the verse that's lifted up at the end of the story. On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. This story is about God's hospitality. Because you see, the peoples of the ancient Near East at that time, archaeologists have told us, did practice child sacrifice. Almost universally, they believed that their gods required these propitiating sacrifices, the blood of human beings, the blood of their own children, in order to preserve their future, in order to be compelled into providing for them. But Abraham, long before the story that we heard today, heard the voice of a different God. Abraham heard the voice of a God who created all that is. Created the world in graciousness and love and in provision so that we only had to stretch out our hands to receive what it is that we need. And this God was so gracious and loving that God continued to come to people throughout all cultures and all times and places, I believe, and most particularly through Abraham and through his children who became the people of Israel, through the law, through the prophets, through miracle after miracle, and most clearly in Jesus, his son. God decided that God couldn't be separated from us any longer, and instead of just continuing to provide hospitality, God said, I'm going to go and receive their hospitality. And in some places, Jesus was received, right? In lots of places, those people received the blessings of welcoming God's very self in the person of the Christ. But we know that in the end, that hospitality was not received. In the end, Jesus was put on the cross, made to carry the wood of that sacrifice, just like Isaac did. He was not sacrificed. He offered himself. And on the third day rose again, because we know that God's love crushed to earth is not going to stay dead, right? God's hospitality returns to us again and again, and God says, it's okay, welcome. I'm just showing you how much I love you. Come on in, receive my love, receive peace, and give it. This giving and receiving, this is the, I'm sorry, Brian, I'm messing with this thing. I'm trying to get it to go here. This giving and receiving is the essence of hospitality, and it has made me come to believe over the years that hospitality is not just something nice to do if we get around to it. It's not just a good idea. It's not just the name of our secondary industry here in the Napa Valley. Hospitality is the very core of what it means to live in community with God and with one another, as Christ has shown us. Now, Vince and I were talking about how we've experienced hospitality over the years, and we got to talking about the second, third, and fourth years of our marriage when we lived in El Salvador. And, you know, this passage about being welcomed into people's homes and where you find welcome and people who give welcome, this kind of practice of just welcoming and being welcomed, it completely summarized my ministry in El Salvador. Because I did things in the church. We ran a school, we had a lot of things to organize. But my ministry happened within a block of that church building where everyone who attended that little church on the outskirts of San Salvador lived. And the street was a pretty busy street, but off of the street were these little passageways where the houses faced each other across concrete sidewalks. And I just would walk up and down that street and say hello to people. And invariably, someone would invite me in, and there would be a glass of soda with some ice cubes in it. And there would be a quesadilla, which in El Salvador is a little cake made with cheese. Doesn't involve a tortilla. Or there might be a tortilla, or there might be a fresh made pupusa, or something just coming out of the oven, some soup. Whatever it was, there was always food that was offered. And that giving and that receiving was the blessing, right? It was the thing. Vince and I lived in a little apartment a few miles, about 10, 15-minute drive from that neighborhood, a very different part of the city. But we became a place of welcome, and were able to offer hospitality to a lot of people who were visiting El Salvador, or people like us that maybe were working in the country but didn't live there. We became kind of the expat crash pad in the city for some of our friends who lived outside of the city. So we had a little tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor, and sometimes there would be 9 of us sleeping there, on the couches and the hammocks. So Vince would cook a chicken, if you've had one of Vince's chickens, you know what I'm talking about. And we would share with one another our lives, our home, our food. And in that giving and that receiving, you see, that was the thing. That's the thing. Jesus showed us this pattern of giving and receiving, in that, he wasn't content just to offer his life, because if God was born, God was going to die. And if Jesus was going to live a path of nonviolent resistance, that was going to meet an end, which is pretty predictable, right? We know what happened to Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Oscar Romero. They were just following Jesus' pattern. Jesus, for him, that wasn't enough. He had to give and receive hospitality with his beloveds in that last night before he died. And he gathered them around a table, and we do that every Sunday. We do it and we hear his words, "Receive me. I want to give myself to you. Become what it is that you receive. Take my body and my blood into yourself. Take my love and my presence into yourself. And then go out and share that. It's about giving what you've received." I feel like our culture today is not so much about hospitality. I mean, we sort of struggled with it to begin with, and then COVID told us for 2 years that any stranger that you see, was probably going to inadvertently kill you. But we've got to find a way to turn that around, especially as Christians of an open and welcoming and hospitable variety. Our job is to walk out those doors and to be what it is that we've received. To give not just food or a cup of cold water or an open door, but to give of ourselves. I think most fundamentally that means to recognize another person's humanity. Do you know how infrequently we do that? We pass scores of other human beings walking around in our world every day. And how often are we caught up in the miracle that that other human being is? How often do we let them see a reflection of that miracle in our eyes as we greet them, as we offer them love? A colleague this week remarked that she felt like rather than giving cups of cold water to thirsty people in our world today, it seems like more often we take a cup of cold water and we dump it on the ground in front of a thirsty person. That seems to be more the norm as our country, our world becomes more and more aggressive, right? It's not just this sort of cutting off and separation. It's almost going on an attack. And I read this reading today and I thought, basically Jesus is telling us, don't be a jerk, Just be kind, be human. I've seen shirts that say, be kind, be human, be both, be humankind. Right? That's all Jesus is asking of us, to be true to our original purpose, to be created beings in loving relationship with God and one another. How hard could that be? But it's very hard. It's very hard. Especially when we're in a world that presents us with threats on every side, especially we're in a world where just giving a cup of cold water is now countercultural. But my friends, the way of love that Jesus invites us to, this way of the hospitality of God, it's always been a way that cuts against the grain. It's always been a way that takes us a little bit uphill. So I'm glad that we're here today. Whether we're here in person or online, we have a new way of offering hospitality, don't we? Welcome. You are welcome here. No matter who you are or where you are from, you are welcome. We are all welcomed by the God who loves us, the God who provides for us, the God who feeds and fills us and says, come on in. And we're invited as we digest that welcome to go forth and to offer it to every other human being and to all of creation. My friends, I've said these things to you in the name of our friend and our Savior, Jesus the Christ. Amen.